In the heart of Cedar Grove, a quiet, picturesque town tucked away in rural America, crime was almost unheard of. The locals lived simple, peaceful lives. The streets were lined with quaint homes, and neighbors knew each other by name. In this serene backdrop, everyone thought they were safe. But that illusion of safety was shattered one fateful evening when tragedy struck the Turner family. It all began on a warm autumn evening. The town was preparing for the annual Harvest Festival, a tradition where families gathered, ate pie, and celebrated the simple pleasures of life. It was the kind of place where life seemed to move at a slower pace, far removed from the chaos and crime of larger cities. People took comfort in this tranquil setting, believing that such horrors could never happen here. That evening, Jill Turner, a 34-year-old mother of two and a well-loved member of the community, suddenly collapsed after dinner. Her husband, Tom Turner, a quiet and reserved man, frantically called 911, claiming that she was feeling ill. He described her symptoms as sudden and unexplained, offering no clear indication of what had caused her sudden collapse. At first, it seemed like a tragic but isolated incident. Emergency responders rushed to the Turner home, but despite their efforts, Jill was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Shock rippled through Cedar Grove as residents tried to understand what had happened. Jill had been healthy, vibrant, and full of life just days earlier. How could someone so young and full of promise be gone so suddenly? The initial reports from the local coroner pointed to a possible heart attack, though there were no previous signs of health problems. But the autopsy told a different story. Jill had not died of natural causes. She had been poisoned. The news sent shockwaves through the town. The small, tight-knit community was now forced to confront the unthinkable. The death of one of their own had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act, a murder carried out in a home that many had once considered safe. The investigation into Jill's death soon revealed a horrifying truth. The person responsible for her death was none other than her husband, Tom Turner. The shocking revelation that her own spouse was the murderer sent the town into a frenzy. How could someone so close, someone who had sworn to love and protect her, be capable of such a heinous act? As detectives began to dig deeper into the Turner family's life, the picture that emerged was one of secrets, lies, and hidden motives. Tom Turner, it seemed, had been struggling with severe financial issues, which he had kept hidden from his wife. The couple's seemingly perfect marriage was far from what it appeared, and now the community would have to grapple with the reality that one of their own had been betrayed by the very person they trusted the most. In the coming days, questions would swirl. What drove a man to poison the woman he loved? Was it financial, desperation, a hidden affair, or something even darker? And most chilling of all, how had Tom managed to carry out the crime in such a methodical, calculated way? As the investigation progressed and the evidence began to stack up, it became clear that the death of Jill Turner was not just a tragic accident, but the beginning of a twisted tale of deceit, betrayal, and murder in a town that would never be the same again. What was once a peaceful, idyllic community had been forced to confront the darkest side of human nature. Now, the small town of Cedar Grove, known for its safety and simplicity, would become the backdrop for one of the most shocking murder cases the area had ever seen. The question that haunted everyone in the town: how well do we really know the people closest to us? This tragic event would forever change the course of lives in Cedar Grove and serve as a chilling reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, danger can strike from the least expected places. At first glance, Jill and Tom Turner seemed like the perfect couple. They were well liked in the small town of Cedar Grove, with their picture-perfect family and stable, quiet life. Jill was known for her warm smile, her kind heart, and her dedication to her children. Tom, on the other hand, was a quiet, reserved man who seemed to have a gentle demeanor. The couple had been married for over 12 years and were raising 2 children together in a beautiful home on the outskirts of town. To outsiders, it seemed like a classic American family living the dream. Jill was a woman full of life. A former high school teacher, she had recently left her job to focus on her growing family. She was always involved in her children's activities, volunteering at the local schools, and attending church with her family every Sunday. Her passion for helping others was well known throughout the town, and she was considered the heart of the community. Friends and neighbors described her as someone you could count on, always ready with a listening ear or a kind word. Jill's life was centered around her family, but she also found time to stay active in community affairs. She organized charity events, helped with local fundraisers, and was always there for her neighbors when they needed her. With her bright smile and infectious personality, she was adored by many in Cedar Grove. Her home, which she shared with Tom and their 2 children, was always full of laughter and love. Tom, on the other hand, was a man of few words. He worked as a mechanic running his own small repair shop in town. People often described him as quiet and reserved, with a knack for fixing things. Though not particularly outgoing, Tom was a solid, dependable figure in Cedar Grove. His clients respected him for his work ethic and attention to detail, and his reputation as a reliable mechanic was well earned. But beyond his work, Tom remained somewhat of an enigma. He had always been a bit of a private person, avoiding the spotlight and keeping his personal life to himself. He and Jill were known to keep a low profile, living a humble life in their cozy home. They rarely hosted gatherings or socialized with others outside their immediate circle. In fact, Tom's reserved nature made him appear mysterious to those around him, which only added to the mystique of the couple. On the surface, Jill and Tom appeared to be living the American dream. They had built a life together, raised their children, and created a stable, happy home. Friends and neighbors admired their relationship, believing it to be built on mutual respect and love. It seemed like they were the perfect match, with a strong bond that had withstood the test of time. There was no indication of any underlying issues, and no one had ever suspected anything out of the ordinary in their marriage. However, as the investigation into Jill's death began to unfold, a different picture of the couple emerged. Beneath the veneer of the perfect family, there were cracks that no one had noticed. Tom, it seemed, had been hiding a deep financial struggle. His mechanic shop, once a thriving business, had fallen on hard times. He had been borrowing money from friends and family, and there were signs that his debts were mounting. Jill, ever the optimist, had no idea that her husband was dealing with such significant financial pressure. Over the years, Tom's quiet demeanor had disguised his growing sense of desperation. As bills piled up and his shop continued to falter, Tom began to feel trapped. The facade of the perfect life he had built with Jill began to crumble, but he kept his troubles hidden. Those closest to him never suspected that Tom, a man who appeared to be so dependable and hard-working, might be carrying such a heavy burden. He had always been a private man, and his inability to open up about his struggles became his downfall. Meanwhile, Jill, ever the supportive wife, continued to pour her energy into their family, unaware of the financial strain her husband was under. She believed that everything was fine, trusting Tom to handle any issues that arose. Her world was built around her children and the love she had for her husband, which made the shocking revelation of Tom's secrets all the more devastating. Behind closed doors, the tension between the couple had been rising. Tom's mounting debt and emotional stress were taking a toll on their relationship. But to those around them, their marriage still appeared to be strong. They were affectionate in public, and there were no visible signs of conflict or marital discord. No one ever suspected that the seemingly perfect couple was hiding such deep-rooted issues. In fact, some even described Tom as a loving husband, always considerate and patient with Jill. He was the kind of man who would help a neighbor with a flat tire or offer a hand when someone was in need. But behind the scenes, the pressure of his failing business and the financial weight of his hidden debts were slowly eroding his mental state. The dynamic between Jill and Tom, while outwardly harmonious, was marked by secrets and tension. Tom's financial struggles, combined with his inability to communicate with his wife about the situation, created a breeding ground for resentment. As the investigation would later reveal, Tom had begun to view Jill as an obstacle, someone who was unaware of the depth of his struggles, and someone he could no longer rely on for emotional support. The love and affection that had once defined their relationship were now overshadowed by an unbearable weight. As the investigation continued, the picture of the couple's life became clearer. What had appeared to be a simple, happy marriage was, in fact, built on layers of hidden anxiety and unspoken tensions. Jill, the loving wife, had been unaware of the emotional and financial turmoil her husband had been hiding, while Tom's quiet demeanor had masked his growing sense of helplessness and desperation. By the time Jill's death was revealed to be the result of poisoning, the truth about the Turner family was far from the idyllic story everyone had believed. The perfect marriage was shattered, and the small town of Cedar Grove would never be the same again. The Turners, once the picture of American happiness, were now at the center of a murder investigation that would uncover the tragic consequences of hidden secrets and unresolved conflicts. Jill's tragic death would serve as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight, even in the most seemingly perfect of relationships. The story of Jill Turner's tragic death began on what seemed to be a typical evening in Cedar Grove. As the warm evening sun cast long shadows over the small town, Jill and Tom Turner settled into their routine at home. The couple's children, a son and a daughter, were already in bed, tucked in for the night. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, one of those rare moments of peace where the house was still and the outside world seemed to fade away. But it was in that very moment that Jill's life would be cut short in a way no one could have predicted. Tom had always been a man of few words, but that night he was quieter than usual. He seemed preoccupied, his brow furrowed in thought, as though he was struggling with something deep inside. Jill noticed it immediately. Her husband's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something darker, something she couldn't quite place. As they sat down for dinner, Jill couldn't help but feel a subtle tension in the air. It was as if Tom was physically present but emotionally distant, his mind far from the table where they were supposed to be sharing a meal. Tom had prepared dinner that evening, something simple yet comforting: chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. Jill hadn't thought much of it. She trusted Tom, as she always had. He was the one who handled most of the cooking in their home, and although she sometimes joked about his experimental recipes, she never questioned his intentions. But this evening, there was something unsettling about the way Tom handed her the plate of food. His actions were too careful, too deliberate, almost as though he were hiding something. The first bite seemed normal enough. The flavors were familiar, comforting even. But within moments of finishing her meal, Jill began to feel strange. Her stomach churned, a feeling of nausea slowly creeping up on her. At first, she thought it might be a minor upset from the food, but as the minutes ticked by, the sensation only worsened. Her head began to spin, her heart raced, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "Tom, I don't feel well," Jill said, her voice trembling as she tried to stand. But her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor. The once quiet house was now filled with the sound of Jill's labored breathing, the air thick with panic. Tom rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he tried to help her up, but she could hardly speak, let alone move. In those final moments, Jill could barely comprehend what was happening to her. Everything around her seemed to blur, and the pain in her chest intensified. Tom, meanwhile, remained eerily calm, as though he was performing a task he had done 1,000 times before. His expressions were emotionless, and the only thing that seemed to matter was his next move, getting rid of any trace of his crime. When Jill finally lost consciousness, Tom did what any desperate person would do. He called 911, but only after he had taken a moment to make sure everything appeared normal. In a voice laced with feigned concern, Tom informed the emergency operator that his wife had suddenly collapsed after dinner. He claimed that he had no idea what had happened and was unsure what to do. The paramedics arrived to find Jill unconscious on the floor, but it was too late. Despite their best efforts to revive her, Jill Turner was declared dead shortly after her arrival at the hospital. 6. The local authorities initially believed Jill's death to be the result of a sudden, unexpected medical event. It wasn't uncommon for people to pass away from heart attacks or strokes and with no obvious signs of foul play. They were inclined to rule the death as natural causes. But as the autopsy report came in, the details began to tell a far more chilling story. Toxicology tests revealed traces of rat poison in Jill's system, enough to kill her in a matter of hours. The revelation was a shock to everyone who knew her. There had been no sign of trauma or injury, no indication of any violent struggle. Jill had been poisoned, slowly and methodically, and her killer had been none other than the man who had promised to love and cherish her for life. Her husband, Tom. The authorities wasted no time in opening an investigation. Tom was immediately taken in for questioning, but at first he denied any involvement in his wife's death. He seemed genuinely distraught, claiming that he was just as much of a victim as Jill. He explained that they had no marital problems, and that Jill had been in perfect health. He even offered up a tearful narrative of how he had been by her side when she collapsed, doing everything he could to save her. However, as the investigation progressed, cracks began to appear in Tom's story. When detectives examined the couple's home more closely, they found that the rat poison used to kill Jill was purchased under Tom's name just days before her death. The poison had been hidden in a drawer in the kitchen, easily accessible to Tom but never noticed by Jill. The poison wasn't even something that Jill would have been familiar with. She had no reason to know about it, and it seemed out of place in their home. Tom had tried to cover his tracks by acting like the grieving husband, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been the one to prepare the meal, the one to serve Jill her poisoned food, and the one to watch as his wife slowly died before him. His motives, it seemed, were rooted in a deep sense of desperation and financial turmoil. The investigation uncovered mounting debts, secret loans, and a business that was failing rapidly. The pressure of his failing business and the strain it placed on their family life had pushed Tom to commit the unthinkable. But why did he choose to kill his wife, the woman he had loved for over a decade? Was it a crime of passion, driven by the weight of his financial problems? Or was it a calculated decision made out of sheer selfishness and greed? The answer may never be fully understood, but one thing was clear. Tom Turner had murdered the woman he had vowed to protect. The impact of Jill's murder rippled throughout the town. Her family, friends, and neighbors were left in shock, struggling to comprehend how someone they had known for years could be capable of such a heinous act. The community had believed in the Turners as a perfect family, and Jill's tragic death shattered that illusion completely. In the days that followed, the small town of Cedar Grove was gripped by fear and disbelief. How could someone in their own community be capable of such a cold-blooded act? And how had Jill's life been taken in such a calculated, insidious way? The answers would come through the investigation, but for many, the pain of losing someone so beloved would never fully heal. Tom Turner had poisoned his wife, but in doing so, he had poisoned his entire family and his community. The town would, never be the same again. And while Tom would eventually stand trial for his crime, the loss of Jill would continue to haunt those who loved her. The small town of Cedar Grove was forever marked by the brutal act that took place in the Turner home, and the ripple effects of Jill's murder would echo through the town for years to come. The sudden death of Jill Turner left the small town of Cedar Grove in a state of shock and grief. Everyone knew Jill. She was the kind of person who brightened up a room the moment she walked in. A loving mother, a devoted wife, and a friendly neighbor. Jill's untimely passing sent ripples through the close-knit community. However, what appeared to be an isolated, tragic event would soon unfold into something far more sinister. At first, the town assumed Jill's death was a heart attack or some other medical incident. After all, the Turners were a well-regarded family, and Jill had seemed in good health. She had always been active, taking care of her children, volunteering at local events, and attending church every Sunday. Her sudden collapse was difficult to understand, but the initial conclusion was that it was simply one of life's inexplicable tragedies. The medical examiner's report, however, raised many questions. Jill's death was not due to a heart attack or stroke. Instead, the toxicology report revealed the presence of rat poison in her bloodstream. The shocking discovery immediately turned the case from an accidental death to a potential murder investigation. The very thought that Jill had been poisoned was almost unimaginable. especially considering her gentle nature and her beloved status in the community. The investigators had no choice but to focus on the only person who was present when Jill fell ill, her husband, Tom Turner. Tom had been the one to call 911 and the one who reported his wife's sudden collapse. At first, his story seemed to be one of genuine concern. He explained that they had enjoyed a quiet evening together and that Jill had seemed perfectly fine until she suddenly became ill. He had tried to help her, he claimed, but she had collapsed and died before he could get her any medical help. However, as the days passed and the investigation unfolded, there were discrepancies in Tom's story. The police began to look closer at his behavior and his actions before and after Jill's death. Tom had claimed to be utterly devastated by his wife's passing, but his reactions seemed cold and detached. There were no signs of real grief or distress, only a man who appeared to be going through the motions of mourning, but who seemed to be hiding something. The investigators turned their attention to the details of Tom's life. The couple had appeared to be financially stable, but as they dug deeper, they discovered a series of troubling signs that painted a much darker picture. It turned out that Tom had been struggling financially for quite some time. The business that he owned, a small construction company, was failing, and he had accrued significant debt. It wasn't just the business that was in trouble. Personal loans and credit card debts were mounting as well. Tom's financial situation was dire, and the stress of it all had been taking a toll on his marriage. But what stood out the most was Tom's motive. As the investigation continued, the police learned that Jill had been the primary breadwinner in the family. She worked as an accountant for a local firm, and her steady income had been keeping the family afloat. Jill had also recently come into a small life insurance payout after the passing of a relative, a sum that could potentially help the family pay off some of their debts. It wasn't a large sum, but for someone like Tom, it was enough to provide a temporary reprieve from his financial troubles. Was this what had driven him to kill his wife? The more the investigators uncovered about Tom's financial troubles, the clearer it became that money and greed might have been key factors in Jill's murder. But there was still the question of how Tom had actually carried out the crime. The rat poison used to kill Jill wasn't something you could find at the local grocery store. It was a highly toxic substance, used mostly for extermination purposes. The investigators learned that Tom had bought the poison a few days before Jill's death, using a fake name to purchase it from a rural farm supply store just outside Cedar Grove. The police also uncovered a hidden stash of the same poison in Tom's garage, raising further suspicions. The poison was stored in an old, unlabeled container, which seemed to indicate that Tom had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He had carefully planned his wife's death, knowing that it would take hours for the poison to work and that Jill would have no idea what was happening to her. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a cold and calculated act of murder. The investigators continued to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Jill's death. They spoke to neighbors, friends, and colleagues, all of whom painted a picture of a seemingly normal, happy couple. No one had any idea that Tom was struggling so deeply with financial problems, and no one had ever suspected that he might be capable of such a heinous act. Jill had been a loving wife and mother, someone who always put her family first, and yet her life had been taken by the very person who should have protected her. Tom's behavior only made the investigation more suspicious. He had been incredibly careful in covering his tracks, and when questioned by police, he remained eerily calm. He stuck to his story, never once admitting to any wrongdoing. His lack of emotion and the contradictions in his statements were enough to make the investigators suspect that Tom knew more than he was letting on. One of the key pieces of evidence that would eventually break the case wide open was a phone call that Tom made to a close friend just hours after Jill's death. The conversation was recorded, and it revealed that Tom had confessed to his friend that he had poisoned Jill. He spoke in a matter-of-fact manner, as though he were discussing a routine task rather than the murder of his wife. This bombshell piece of evidence would be the final nail in Tom's coffin. With the evidence mounting against him, Tom was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The small town of Cedar Grove was left in shock. The man they had known as a husband, father and business owner, was now facing the possibility of life in prison for the cold-blooded killing of his wife. The investigation had unraveled a dark and twisted truth, exposing a man who had allowed his own greed and desperation to lead him to murder. As the case went to trial, the community remained on edge. The loss of Jill Turner was still fresh in their minds, and many struggled to comprehend how someone so close to her could commit such a brutal act. It was a reminder that sometimes the most trusted individuals could be hiding dark secrets behind closed doors. For Jill's family and friends, the pain of her loss would never fully fade, but they could take some comfort in knowing that the man responsible for her death would face justice. For Cedar Grove, life would never be the same again. The murder of Jill Turner had shaken their community to its core, revealing the dangers that could be lurking in even the most idyllic of settings. It was a tragedy that no one would soon forget, and one that would leave its mark on the town for years to come. The trial of Tom Turner was one of the most anticipated and talked about events in Cedar Grove's history. The small, peaceful town was rocked to its core by the shocking murder of Jill Turner, a woman many had known as kind, devoted, and full of life. Now, the man who had been her husband and partner for over a decade stood accused of poisoning her for the sake of money. The courtroom was filled with tension as Tom faced his fate, and the community, still grieving, sought justice for Jill. From the outset, the case against Tom appeared to be strong. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The rat poison found in his wife's system, the incriminating phone call to a friend confessing to the crime, and the discovery of the poison hidden in his garage. Investigators had also uncovered the financial difficulties that Tom had been facing, along with his mounting debts, and the life insurance payout that would have helped alleviate some of the financial burden. It was clear that Tom had a motive, and it seemed all but certain that he had planned the murder, but Tom's defense team wasn't going to make it easy for the prosecution. They quickly set to work trying to cast doubt on the evidence and portray Tom as a man who had been caught in a tragic situation. His attorney argued that the investigation had been rushed and incomplete. According to the defense, the police had jumped to conclusions without fully exploring all possible explanations for Jill's death. They contended that the rat poison in Jill's system could have been ingested accidentally, and that there were other potential explanations for the financial troubles Tom had faced. Despite the defense's attempts to muddy the waters, the prosecution's case was airtight. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the recorded phone call where Tom confessed to a close friend that he had poisoned Jill. The friend, who had initially kept the conversation secret, came forward and testified about what Tom had said. During his testimony, he described Tom's matter-of-fact tone and how the confession seemed to come without remorse or emotion. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and it was impossible for anyone to ignore the chilling nature of Tom's words. The prosecution also called on experts to testify about the poison used in Jill's murder. The rat poison that had killed her was not something that could be easily obtained or ingested by mistake. It was a highly toxic substance, typically used in pest control, and not something one would find in everyday household products. The experts explained how Tom would have had to intentionally administer the poison to his wife, whether by mixing it into her food or drink, and how long it would have taken for the effects to set in. There was no way Jill could have ingested the poison by accident, further solidifying the case against Tom. Tom's demeanor throughout the trial was one of cold detachment. He rarely showed any emotion, and his expressions seemed almost robotic. He sat motionless in the defendant's chair, his eyes fixed straight ahead, never acknowledging the families and friends who had gathered in the courtroom to witness the trial. His lack of remorse, combined with the overwhelming evidence, made it difficult for many in the courtroom to feel any sympathy for him. As the trial wore on, Tom's character began to come under intense scrutiny. The prosecution presented evidence of his increasing financial troubles and his desperate need for money. They outlined how his business was failing, how he had accumulated debt, and how Jill's life insurance policy would provide the financial cushion he so desperately needed. But there was more to Tom's character than just his financial struggles. During cross-examination, Tom's friends and family members were asked to testify about his behavior leading up to Jill's death. Several witnesses described how Tom had become increasingly withdrawn, irritable, and distant in the months before Jill's passing. Some testified that Tom had become obsessed with money, even going so far as to mention how much easier life would be if he didn't have to deal with his financial problems. One witness even recalled a conversation in which Tom had joked about the idea of getting rid of his wife in order to solve his money issues. These statements, though made in passing, were incredibly telling. They painted a picture of a man who was willing to go to extreme lengths to escape his financial troubles. For Jill's family, the trial was a painful and emotional experience. They had lost their daughter, sister, and mother in the most brutal and senseless way imaginable. Throughout the trial, Jill's family sat in the courtroom, their faces a mixture of grief and disbelief. They could not comprehend how Tom, a man who had shared their lives for so many years, could commit such a heinous act. For them, the trial was not just about seeking justice for Jill. It was about coming to terms with the fact that someone they had trusted had murdered a beloved member of their family. The defense tried to present Tom as a man who had been under immense stress and pressure, but their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Their attempt to paint Tom as a victim of circumstance was not convincing. The jury could see that this was not a case of a man who had been pushed to the edge by life's difficulties. This was the case of a man who had chosen to take the life of his wife to solve his own problems. As the trial reached its conclusion, the jury deliberated carefully. The evidence, including Tom's confession, the toxicology reports, and his financial troubles, had made it clear that he had murdered Jill in cold blood. The jury returned after only a few hours, and their verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. Tom Turner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions: relief that justice had been served, but also an overwhelming sense of sadness for Jill's family. While they could never get her back, the conviction of Tom Turner provided some measure of closure to a painful chapter in their lives. For Cedar Grove, the trial was a reminder that even in the most tranquil of towns, darkness could lurk beneath the surface. The Turners' tragedy was a stark illustration of the dangers of greed, control, and deception. It left the community shaken, but also determined to honor Jill's memory and to ensure that such a tragedy would never be forgotten. The tragic poisoning of Jill Turner left a profound impact on both the small town of Cedar Grove and her family. What had once been a quiet, idyllic community was now scarred by the brutality of a crime that no one could have anticipated. For the residents of the town, the murder shattered their sense of safety and trust. Cedar Grove was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where the pace of life was slow and peaceful. Yet, the murder of Jill, a beloved member of the community, turned everything upside down. The trial that followed brought even more attention to the case, with media outlets descending on the town to cover the dramatic courtroom proceedings. As Tom Turner was convicted and sentenced, many in the community felt a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. There was a collective sense of closure, but it did little to erase the pain that Jill's death had caused. Cedar Grove would never be the same again. The town was forced to confront the reality that even in the most seemingly perfect places, evil could still take root. For Jill's family, the aftermath of her death was equally devastating. They not only had to grapple with the grief of losing someone so dear, but also had to process the horrifying truth that the person responsible for her murder was someone they had trusted. The betrayal was hard to comprehend, and the pain of her loss was immeasurable. Jill's parents in particular struggled with the thought that their daughter's life had been taken by the man she had loved and married. In the years following the trial, Cedar Grove slowly began to heal, but the memories of Jill's life and death remained embedded in the hearts of those who knew her. Her family, though broken, found strength in each other and in the support of the community. The legacy of Jill Turner would live on, not as a tragic victim, but as a reminder of the dark side of human nature and the importance of vigilance in even the safest places. The tragic story of Jill Turner's poisoning and her husband Tom's betrayal serves as a stark reminder of the complexities within relationships and the hidden dangers that can lie beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary lives. There are several key lessons we can take away from this heartbreaking tragedy. First, it underscores the importance of recognizing the signs of manipulation and control in relationships. Tom Turner, despite his outward appearance as a loving husband, was ultimately driven by a need for power and control. This story reminds us that toxic relationships can sometimes be masked by charm, leaving victims, like Jill, trapped in situations that no one outside the relationship may fully understand. It serves as a warning that not all abusive relationships involve physical violence. Emotional and psychological abuse can be just as dangerous, even leading to something as horrifying as murder. Another lesson is the significance of paying attention to small changes in behavior and routine. Jill's sudden decline in health and Tom's odd actions were red flags that, had they been noticed sooner, might have led to a different outcome. This tragedy serves as a reminder for loved ones to stay vigilant, to notice when something feels off, and to speak up when concerned. Lastly, this case teaches us the profound impact of community. The town of Cedar Grove, though shaken to its core, came together to support Jill's family and one another. In times of crisis, communities that are connected and supportive can provide the emotional strength needed to heal. Jill's family found comfort in the solidarity of those around them, and while nothing could replace the loss, the compassion and care of the community helped them through the darkest times. In the end, Jill Turner's story is not just a cautionary tale, but also a reminder to cherish those we love and to always stay aware of the deeper currents beneath the surface of our relationships. Jill Turner's life was tragically stolen by the very person she trusted most, her husband, Tom. In the end, justice was served, but it cannot undo the irreparable harm caused by his betrayal. Her story highlights the vulnerability we all face in trusting those closest to us and the devastating consequences when that trust is shattered. While no amount of justice can bring Jill back, her case serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the pursuit of truth. In the end, her memory endures and justice brings a sense of closure to her loved ones.